My name is Julie Pearson Littlefender. Today is Monday, January 14th, 2016, and I'm interviewing Molly Murphy Adams for the Oklahoma Native Artists Project, sponsored by Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State University. Molly, we're at your home in Jenks. You're of Oglala descent and not Oklahoma born, but you've lived in Oklahoma for a while now, and you've been working professionally for about 12 years. You describe your artwork as contemporary native sculptural beadwork, and it's drawn a lot of attention for its strong conceptual basis as well as its technical prowess. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Well, thank you.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Great Falls, Montana, and it's in central Montana. And I grew up all around Great Falls, and then when I was about 9, we moved to western Montana, to the Missoula area, and then we lived in a variety of places on and around Missoula. And I consider the Flathead Reservation to be kind of the home that I think of when I think about going back. And my mom still lives in Kalispell, Montana.
What did your folks do for a living?
My mom did a little bit of everything over the years, but mostly did her best to try to raise us without a lot of resources. And my father was a carpenter off and on.
How about brothers or sisters?
2 brothers that I grew up with, and 1 sister that was raised outside of the home. But my parents had lots of on-again, off-again relationships, and the half-siblings are hard to count. I told you it would be complicated from the beginning.
What was your relationship with your grandparents on either side of your family?
My mother was given up for adoption as an infant, and so I didn't know she didn't know her biological parents until right around the time I was born. So I was lucky enough to know my biological grandparents from my mother, her adoptive parents, and then my father's parents. So I had a lot of grandparents. And I was especially close to my dad's mother, my paternal grandmother. And she was a really strong influence in my life and a source of great stability and a person with a lot of charm. And her name was Mary Eva, and she taught me a lot about sewing and embroidery, and even later when I got into beadwork and dancing at powwows, she was really supportive of it, which in Montana said a lot for a non-native person to come to powwows and be supportive of that. But she taught me a real love of everything that grows, of gardening and flowers, and even as she got older, I knew that everything was all right as long as Nana was excited about the next seed catalog that came along. So I was really close to her, but I was really fortunate to get to know my mom's biological parents and to understand that kind of complexity in her life. And in fact, I just booked a ticket to go to California here in a couple of months to visit my biological grandmother, who's from Pine Ridge. So I don't get to see her as often as I would like, but I've got a ticket to go see her pretty soon. And so my biological grandparents on my mom's side, my grandmother was from Pine Ridge, and my grandfather was half Lebanese, and he was from Arizona. And they met when they were young, and then had a fling, and my grandmother got pregnant with my mom and ran away to Montana and gave her up for adoption. But they ended up getting married and having another daughter, and my mom found them later when she was an adult, and so we've had a relationship with them and with my aunt and my cousins and ongoing.
That's wonderful. Wonderful. So in terms of extended family members who were interested in art that you were exposed to growing up?
My mom had an innate interest and always wanted to pursue it, though her circumstances really didn't let her do that until she was much older. She started to learn beadwork as a way to try to reconnect with her background with being native. She found a beadwork teacher in Great Falls by the name of Ruby Stiffarm, and it was through the Head Start program, and a lot of the native ladies in Great Falls kind of organized through Head Start. It was a mutually supportive way, and through Head Start a lot of the older ladies were teaching the younger women beadwork. And so Ruby taught my mom beadwork when she was in her early to mid-20s, and it was something that she took off with, and I waited for her to connect back. But she didn't get to pursue it in a big scale professionally until she was older. and she actually had a grant through the First People's Fund and was doing really well with it. But she has a few disabilities that have hamstrung her ability to work in it. The other person that was a pretty strong influence in that respect was my dad's sister, Connie. Connie Burgum. She's now a professional illustrator. She went to school, and she actually went to art school. And in a family where I don't think any of my other dad's siblings even went to college. She went to college and she went to art school, which was a pretty gutsy move for a poor Irish kid on the make. So she talked about, even when she was little, using a razor blade to cut out the blank sheets in the front of books at the library to find paper to draw on and stuff. So every Christmas, birthday, any holiday growing up, without fail, no matter where we were, what the circumstances were, she sent me books and art supplies. So calligraphy pens, pastel pencils, paper. She just sent random stuff knowing I would like it, and books. Lots and lots of books. So she's an illustrator now and also does mosaics and paints, and so she was a really strong a supporter in lots of little small ways.
Great gifts she gave you. What is your first memory of seeing Native art?
Well, some of my first memories were the pieces my mom actually worked on. She did some large-scale clothing pieces for, not Rendezvous Days, but in Calgary Stampede. She did a couple of full outfits in the 80s that won some prizes. And then even when I was little, she would go to the library to do research. But I think the first time I saw Native art or artifacts in any sense was growing up in Great Falls. The Charlie Russell Museum was the mainstay. Every kid went to the Charlie Russell Museum and did the tour, probably every year. It's the only museum in Great Falls. And as a kid, I thought every town had a Charlie Russell. Like some guy who lived there who painted and collected stuff and had a house. And it wasn't until I got older that I realized that Charlie Russell was important in other places. I thought he was just Great Falls and it was just our thing. Because a lot of the banks still had his paintings up, and he had, even in the 80s, there were still bars. And it was still he was still our local guy. Right. And so I didn't realize he was the big deal everywhere until much later. But every year the grade school, there weren't that many places to go on a school day trip. You might go see the place that used to be the Great Falls. They would point at the water and go, well, we have a dam, but we used to have falls. Or they would take you to the Charlie Russell, or maybe they would take you to a Hooterite farm or something, but there weren't that many options for school trips. So every year it was pretty much the Russell Museum. And it was an amazing collection, and you could, as a kid, go there every year and see something new all the time. And now I have a much greater appreciation for how any museum would scramble to have an original.
So I understand you learned tanning at an early age as well as beadwork, and that's pretty unusual. Can you tell us about that?
It's less unusual, I think, in Montana, just because there's a lot of, I think, still skills that are more common there. I also chopped wood. We had wood stoves. We had oil lamps. There was a lot of things we did that were more basic. Now, my mom wanted to learn hide tanning because brain tan hide is the best hide to work with for making traditional clothing. And I was also making regalia for dancing, and you want good brain tan. And we also spent a lot of time at the Salish Kootenai Tribal Cultural Camp. It's a camp that is kind of in between Arley and St. Ignatius, way up in the mountains, and an elder by the name of Agnes Vanderberg ran it for years. The idea behind it was that everybody would go and camp away from town and make their own community for the summer in this place, the same spot year after year after year. And it was a way to have maybe more of a natural kind of rhythm throughout the summer. So for quite a few summers in a row, my family would go and live there in the summer and pitch a teepee, and for as much time as we could, just live there. And and then the other thing is the camp hosted classes for the tribal college. But because we were there all the time, a lot of us learned how to tan. And there was George Coffey was an instructor out there, and he would rig up the stretchers, and all of us kids helped him pull and hold and stretch. And he taught us how to make scrapers with a coffee can lid that you cut and fold in half and grind down the edges. And my mom became really, really good at it, and then she became a presenter and would do workshops at places like the Oom Pishkin State Park in Great Falls, at the Buffalo Jump. And then as my mom's physical disabilities became worse, I would often go along to help her so that she could do the presentation of the information, and then I would do all the arm work, because it is really labor intensive work. Yes. And my mom has a lot of physical ailments and just wasn't able to do that kind of, although we discovered there's a lot of shortcuts, so through easier or maybe more longer work but less intensive. So we found a lot of sort of cheats and shortcuts. I still know how to do it. I can't say I like tanning. Mm-hmm. It's smelly and it's hard. But the results are definitely pretty desirable. And this is the first year I've found someone who will sell me hides at a reasonable price. And the other hard part about tanning is that, well, I live in a suburban environment now. I don't have a creek out back. I don't have the luxury of a lot of cold weather, which is preferable. And I don't have access to hunters who know how to prep hides the proper way. And there's nothing worse than going through all that time to have something that's full of holes at the end because it wasn't properly treated. So it's something I'm glad I know how to do, and it's something I'm glad I spent all that time doing it, but it is an intensive skill, and there's a reason why a lot of people would rather skip it.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know if my neighbors would approve of the smell or the flies or the whole thing. Well, I don't know how they would feel about that.
What is your first memory of making art?
I think it was probably, I would learn to draw. The Montana winters are really long, and we would get bulb catalogs in the winter, and I would have small scrap, pieces of paper, colored pencils, pens, really basic stuff. And I would draw the flowers in the bulb catalogs over and over and over until I could draw an iris or a tulip or a daffodil or any bulb flower. Not so much seed catalogs, but just the bulbs. And they were gorgeous. And in the wintertime, when everything's dark and cold and frozen, here are these big, beautiful color blooms, and they're verdant and succulent and sensual, and they're just so big and colorful. And I drew them obsessively until I finally, when I was 14, decided I wanted to draw an entire garden. And so I went to the art supply store in Missoula, and I bought what was just the most obscenely expensive piece of paper. It was a $5 sheet of paper. It was a full-size watercolor or printing sheet. And my aunt had already given me some dry pastel pencils, and I bought 3 good pens, and I set to work doing an entire garden of irises and daffodils and tulips and every color of tulip. And I did it entirely in ink and worked on it for months. And then I slowly went in with pastel pencils and just added like light layers of color over the whole thing. And I ended up giving it away. Wow. So my mom's friend in college, Mary Big Bow, she was visiting. She always kept asking to see it. And in a lot of Native traditions, if somebody asks for something or admires something, then the best thing to do is to give it to them. Mm-hmm. And so I gave it to her. And apparently I'm told she still has it at her office at Salish and Kootenai College. So, but I don't. I really would like someone to go get a photo of it, because I have in my head what I think it looked like, but I was 15 or 14 when I gave it to her, so I don't know what it would match up to my memory. Right. But I thought $5 for a piece of paper was amazing. It was a lot.
That was the artist in you coming out. Have you been strongly drawn to three-dimensional work, though, throughout?
No.
Okay.
First of all, because I didn't know anybody who did three-dimensional work. The few people I knew growing up, nobody had a college education. Nobody reached out past that. So I knew people who made traditional clothing for powwows, or I knew people who drew, because that was cheap and and effective, and you could draw on paper, and everybody had ballpoint pens or pencils. And it really was not until college that I began to really fall in love with three-dimensional and think that way. I was already good at thinking spatially, but to think about how to take the ideas of 2D and wrap it around. So I had a couple of great professors who helped me sort of cross over that into 3 dimensions. And then also what naturally led me there is I was trying to, in art school, figure out how to take what I was learning in school, concepts, ideas that I was really drawn to, and how was I going to make any kind of art that was authentic to what I knew. Mm-hmm. So that's the whole struggle with art school. Really, you're supposed to take all these skills that somebody's teaching you, and then you're supposed to filter through that everything that what makes your work any different or better than anyone else's. And I guess it's sort of a path to being authentic to what your story might be. And for me, what that was this obsession with needlework. And the best way to do that was to try to think of it in 3 dimensions. Now I'm going back to kind of 2 dimensions, but at the time, 3 dimensions was the obvious place to do that in. To take everything I knew about making clothing and parfleche and hide tanning and all these things, and somehow try to find a way to make art with that. Mm-hmm. So the first step was to make these sculptural boxes that were influenced by parfleche designs, so I ended up getting my emphasis in ceramics. I can't really make a pot to hold water, but ceramics was a place where we learned about 3 dimensions and about repetition and about form and really all the subtleties of form. Mm-hmm. And it was also a place where it let go of those ideas that art had to be a painting on a canvas that somebody put in a frame and that was the way you made art. So that was, ceramics just kind of beat it out of me through trial and error.
Well, you weren't always on an art track, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but were there any experiences you had in school at any level with art that were significant?
There was. I had a ceramics professor, Tom Rapon, who really taught me the value of process and multiples.
Now, is this at the college level, or is this
This is the college. I actually did not take a single art class before college.
Okay.
I didn't have an art class, not beyond the 2-month time in junior high where they give you a little special class, and I had no art classes in high school. So I didn't have an art class until I was in my mid-20s in college. So everything before that was just self-taught. But Tom Rapon convinced me to start working in multiples and helped me through what I called my food phase, which was, for a while I was convinced I wanted to make giant ceramic sculptures in the manner of Wayne Thiebaud, the painter, and he indulged me and kind of taught me to indulge myself. I was feeling so much pressure being in college, being a young mom. My mother was disabled. I didn't have a lot of support, and here I was doing this frivolous thing of art, and I felt nervous. I had to get it right first every time. I wasn't giving myself any space to fail at anything, and that's not a very healthy approach to artwork. And so I did this project where I made 100 ceramic cupcakes. And they were all different colors and pop colors, and it was ridiculous, and it was fun, and it was kind of pointless, but I learned a lot, and it was multiples, and it really fed my idea of working in these grids and these pixels, and even if they were cupcakes. And that was a really wonderful, if pointless moment, and he kind of let me figure it out. And then there was a lecture by a visiting artist, Dick Notkin. He's a ceramicist in Helena, and has worked with the Archie Bray Studio. He came and did a lecture that was mostly on mold making, ceramic mold making. But he had this moment in there where he talked about distilling what you do that's different and maybe strange and maybe weird, and to literally to keep distilling it, to keep finding out. And so you did this one thing, and there's this part of it that you like, keep crushing it and remaking it and reworking it and going back through it until you find, and if you keep doing this and keep pursuing what is absolutely unique about it, then you'll find what it is that you do that is worth doing and worth doing differently or worth doing well. He put it better at the moment, and I've kind of garbled his quote since then, but it was something that resonated with me at that time. Sometimes you hear the right thing at the right time, and at a different time it wouldn't work, but at that moment it was what I needed to hear, which was to do what I was doing that was different, even if I wasn't doing it right yet. Mm-hmm. So it kind of started me off on find this thing and then just keep reworking it and refining it until you get it to the point where it is working.
Now, prior to getting into art, you were on a science track for a while. I was. So in addition to telling us a bit about that, I wonder if you can tell us how maybe that whether it provided any kind of base once you changed tracks.
I graduated from high school early. I was 16. I did high school in 3 years, partly because I was very determined to get out of a dysfunctional house, and partly because I was ambitious. And everything I did in high school was science track. I loved science. I loved the theory, the philosophy. I loved this. I had an ideal about science, that science was the ideal. It was rational in a very irrational world, and it had the potential to do documentable good, unambiguous good. And I loved this idealism about it. And so when I started college, and a friend of my mom's and a friend of mine who was Blackfeet, Judy Gobert, she wrote a grant, and my very first job in high school was working in a laboratory. So she got this grant for more people, for basically diversity in laboratory workplaces. So I was 2 weeks shy of my 16th birthday and going for my first job in a lab coat in a virology laboratory. So I had to learn I was support staff there for the remainder of high school, and it was also my job in college. And so I worked in a high lab, functioning laboratory, and that was my job in high school instead of flipping burgers or washing cars or something. I loved it, but by the end of my first year of college, I started college right before I was 17, and by the time I was finishing college, my first year, I was 17, and I was completely burned out, and I needed to take some time away from school, and I really was quite sure that I didn't want to have a career in virology. The downside of working in the laboratory is I had a real window into their lives and their careers, and sometimes that can be a dangerous thing to see how someone's life will turn out if you pick this path. It might be better to be naive and just go with it, and maybe give yourself a chance to remake it in a different fashion. But I saw this life, and I didn't want it, and I thought if I pursue this doctorate in virology, I'm either going to be at a university dependent on NIH grants for funding, or I'm going to have to go to Atlanta and work with the CDC in some capacity, and because there's not that many job avenues for epidemiologists, which is what I was fascinated with. So I still read about it in my spare time for fun. But so I quit school and did a variety of things for a long time, and I had this ethical debate about what I was working on, and people go into it with these ideas of what they're going to work on, but they're really working on somebody else's ideas who was there 15 years before and who got the position of power and is writing the grants. So I was a little disillusioned. And at 17, it's very easy to be disillusioned and dramatic and and take time off. And that was part of it, is I was really young for the decisions I was making. And whether I knew that whether I was taking the time off for the right reasons, the time off was really necessary. So when I went back to school, 5 years later, I wanted to go into the architectural design program at MSU, but I found out my credits wouldn't transfer, and in kind of the path of least resistance, I thought, well, I'll stay here and get my BFA and then go on to do my master's in architectural design. It would actually be less time, but by the time I was finishing my BFA, I really loved it, and I thought, I think maybe I can do this. And I thought, I really don't want to go to grad school. And I'd had a child in the meantime who probably was not also very excited about me going to grad school.
What did you do after you got out of college then with your BFA?
I was, right when I was about to graduate, I was originally planning to go to Albuquerque and pursue a doctorate in art history. And I ended up not pursuing that, partly because my mom had this grant with the Native Peoples Fund, and it had exposed her to a lot of people in the art world, and it exposed me to a lot of people in the art world. And as a result of those connections and of the work that I was doing, my senior thesis show was scheduled to travel before I graduated. Wow. And so I just rolled the dice and said, I'm going to keep doing this for as long as I can. And also, my daughter Anna has Asperger's, and she was still very small and needing a lot of really intensive attention from me, therapy and appointments and work, and just incredible stability. And college hadn't been as stable as I would have liked. So I decided to at least put off grad school, and at this time to pursue art full-time and pursue mothering full-time, and to see if maybe the art couldn't make it work. And every time I would do the math over art versus grad school or a regular job, it just didn't quite add up. So art was making enough of a living and improving quality of life a lot to where the math just kept working out to stick with it. And so I stuck with it. But my mother's connection to the First Peoples Fund made a huge difference. It opened up this big door to an art world that at that time I didn't have a lot of contacts in, or I had very few.
What was your thesis show?
I did a series of 4 sculptural boxes that were influenced by parfleche design. So they were geometric beadwork on wool, and I created this method where I have these wool panels that are mounted over aeronautic plywood, real thin, used for making model airplanes, and then using edge stitch as the closing system for these panels, and then the hinges between the panels. And so I did 4 different kinds of boxes. One tall and narrow, and then one with double doors, one that completely tied with ribbons and then opened up into a flat piece, and then another one that was a long, low box. So different types of boxes with different types of designs, but all with a trade wool cloth basis, and then geometric designs in beadwork on the top of it. And so that 4 boxes was the first series that I did for that. But for quite a few years after that, boxes of all different kinds and colors and shapes, becoming more sculptural, open, no lids, multiple lids, magnets. I just kept expanding that form as much as I could, and that's really what I was known for a long time.
So they were being purchased both by individual collectors and by museums?
Both, but they also had a traveling show obligation, so they were getting seen. And then the first year out of college, I had decided to try for the herd Indian market and was accepted, and so I knew that I wanted to make one big piece, one showstopper piece to try to get noticed at that show. So I made a courting style blanket with a horse motif on it. So wow. Instead of the blanket strip being repeating rosettes and then geometric strips, rosettes, geometric strips, I took the rosettes and I made those be the front shoulders of horses, and instead of the geometric strips, the rosette would be there, and then the horse head would come out of it, and it would meet another horse head coming from the other rosette, and they layered over each other, so it was asymmetric and kind of moving across, and half red and half blue, and then furthered that by bringing the red and the blue opposite in a landscape and sky design at the top and the bottom. And so the beaded strip across the middle was entirely beaded, but I didn't do it in traditional geometrics. It was all free-form beadwork, so I broke a lot of rules. It was like an opportunity to try every single color of bead I had, and every finish, and every kind of stitch in it. And it was a real tour de force, and it was a lot of fun. And my only regret is the blanket was 6 feet 3 inches wide, and the booths at the herd are 6 feet wide. So I was like,
oh wow!
I was lucky to have an end booth because I kept creeping out into the lane, because one of those small practical details that you don't pay attention to. So that,
did it sell?
It won an honorable mention, which is a big deal for your first time at the herd. So it got me on the list, and it got me in the award show, and that was incredible. I chose not to sell it because it was asked to be in a traveling show, and so they. Ellen Taubman asked to put it in the Changing Hands,
right.
And I said yes. So I felt it was more important that it traveled than it sold. So, and I mean, we had a seller lined up for it by the end, but it was working for me as it was traveling.
Right. I think maybe I read it was not too long after that you did a show, I don't know, and there were some t-shirts there, Tribal Size Me, and I wondered if you could talk about that show.
Yeah, I can. There was a summer at Arley Powwow, where we went every summer and camped and stayed there. There was one summer, or no, it was at Kiayo Powwow. It was in the spring, and I went to go get a T-shirt. I wanted to buy a powwow T-shirt, and I went to go and I asked for a medium or a small, and they said they didn't have any left. They just had tribal size left, and it was one of those moments where I kind of looked around at powwow, and first of all, I was completely insulted at the term. I thought that's really grotesque. I don't like to hear that. But I looked around and I saw something that I maybe hadn't noticed, and a lot of us hadn't noticed, is that Indian country had gotten really big. and I looked around, and it was that's when I noticed how the obesity epidemic, and with it the diabetes epidemic, and the health issues, and the next powwow in a few months at Arley, I had this idea, and I noticed a lot of it. I hadn't noticed how it had happened, and so I went to the next powwow at Arley, and I went to all these different T-shirt vendors, and I was amazed at how many XX and XXX and quadruple X T-shirts you could buy. This is a niche market. This is a little, not a small powwow, but I was surprised at that, and finding smalls and mediums was hard. So I bought a selection of these T-shirts of all these different ideas and concepts on these T-shirts. And one of them I loved was, here's this XXX T-shirt with this graphic design of this totally cut, muscly native guy playing basketball. And it's a quadruple X T-shirt. And it's like the native baller. And he is, and it's like those basketball dreams of back when. And the person wearing it would be barely ambulatory. Right. And I thought, this is really, and that same powwow that year, I saw that a woman who's a wonderful beadworker that I admired, her leg was amputated, and she had lost a foot. And I was like, this is an ugly thing that we're all gonna have to look at. And at the time, so I took these T-shirts and I created these sculptures by doing beadwork on them that resembles traditional beaded war shirts, so 19th century beaded war shirts. So the strips going down the sleeves and the front, and embellishing them. And I called the series Tribal Size Me, 1 through 4. And when the T-shirts are laid flat and they're mounted on the wall, so there's foam core behind them, but you can't see it, so they look like just the shirt flat mounted on the wall with the beadwork on it. First of all, it strikes you how enormous the shirts are, and then it's these war shirts by warriors that can't be warriors. It's really hard to be proactive about your community or your future when you are in fear of your own health every day. Since then, the issue has become so mainstreamed.
I was going to say you were in advance, I think.
Yeah, that was a while ago. That was 2005, 2004. Since then, almost every tribe has a health center and a workout facility. The Salish tribe has a shuttle system that drives elders to the very large gym facility they have. I mean, tribes are aware of it. They're proactive. The community is proactive, and it has, I think, changed for the better. And small things. Arley Powwow used to throw candy to kids, and now they pass out fresh fruit and water bottles to the drummers. Small things like that, trying to make the spiritual and social healthy activities also physically healthy. And it's a wonderful step that they've taken, and in hindsight, as obvious as banning alcohol from powwows. It wasn't that long ago that powwows had beer gardens. And when at some point everybody, as Maya Angelou says, you do your best until you know better, and then when you know better, you do better. And I think this is a case where tribal communities are saying, we know better now, and we're going to try to do better so that we don't have elders missing feet, and we don't have people who can't work or participate because of diabetes, and we're not subjecting kids to the same conditions. I was incredibly worried that the piece was going to be received poorly, because I was taught very specifically that beadwork should be a positive thing always, and it should not ever be something you approach with a negative attitude or a mindset. I mean, the traditional way of doing beadwork is to think of it as something that you're doing as a part of your community, and to think that you're going to use this skill to be critical of people was a real question for me about can I use this skill to be critical of my own community, or is that a negative thing? And I didn't receive any negative feedback from it. But I think, especially after the first year that I exhibited them, the momentum and the public awareness was there. And has just continued. I don't think anyone would bat an eye at it now. I don't think it would be seen as anything out there at all. And that was probably one of those moments that was far more in my head than about my own concerns about how it was going to be received than the reality was.
So you've mentioned a couple of shows that were important, the traveling show and this particular show. What was another important museum show for you early on the Changing Hands?
The Changing Hands was really important on a national level. Part of the way that the Museum of Arts and Design did the catalog was gorgeous and thoughtful and really respectful of Native artists and where they might be or where they might have come from. They did some unique things, which was that they published, instead of saying where you were from, they published where you lived, as though where you are is more important than where you've been. Logical, but not something usually afforded to Native artists. It projected my work from being someone that was just trying things out in Montana to being on a national level really fast, and a lot of people heard my name and saw my work. That was an amazing show. And at the same time, I had an offer from the museum in Missoula, Montana, where I lived. They asked me to have a solo show at the museum there, and that put me on the scene locally or regionally, and I had to prepare a solo show myself from scratch, and I had to make bigger pieces. I thought they were going to give me one of the small side galleries, which was about 15 by 10, and I thought great. And then we walked into this massive gallery, and I kind of started to stop breathing, and I asked the curator, I said, do you know how small beads are? Oh my
goodness, yeah.
Because I said, I can have a 100-hour piece that's would fit my purse. So I had to think differently. I had to make some very large pieces that could fill that space, if not physically, sort of mentally, critically. And so I did 2 really big pieces just for that show that were more conceptual, less beadwork, meant to be seen from 15 feet back, really different from the super tiny, precious work that I had been doing up to that point. And probably the most important piece I did for that was I did a topo map of the Missoula County area, and on red wool, and I did the topo lines in black beads, and then I did the rivers in blue, and then I did it was a map of an event, and then I did the route that Chief Charlo and his band took when they were expelled from the Bitterroot Valley, which is south of Missoula. They were expelled from there finally by the military for the last time in the 1890s and forced north up into the reservation, where most of the tribe already was, but Chief Charlo had been holding out. And so I charted their route, and it turned out really well, and it was on hand-dyed wool, and I was really playing with materials, and it was a wall hanging for starters, so it wasn't functional, and it was a topo map, and it looked great from a distance and up close. And the Missoula Art Museum ended up purchasing it for their permanent collections, which is wonderful because it's a map of that place. But it was 4 feet by 5 feet. It was enormous.
Right.
And but I still made everything in that show. My mindset was still so much that everything was made and it folded and wrapped, and nothing was really big or bulky or permanent. So when I dismantled the show, I packed everything in my show into the trunk of my Honda Accord.
That's amazing.
Everything rolled or folded. I was like, we've got a real nomad here.
Nomadic way.
Yeah, and I loaded it all up in my car, and the staff came up and asked me if I needed a trolley. No, it's all in my Honda outside. I might have had to use some of the back seat, but yeah, an entire solo show of boxes and wall hangings and t-shirts and everything just collapsed and folded and multi-layered over everything, and basically one big Tinker's bundle.
Now, at this point, how much of your work is coming from individual commissions?
Well, in some respects, I've actually slowed down on artwork.
No, I mean at this point early on, a
Oh,
little bit earlier in your career.
At this point, probably it was about 30% commissions and about 70% sales. Most of that coming through the herd market.
Okay.
I mean, that was a major event for me
That was
for
your
quite a
major
few
market.
years. Yeah, it was the right time of year for me, and it was something. It was the time was right to travel every year to there, and the market was good. And also with the issues surrounding my because I'm not federally enrolled, I was not welcome at Santa Fe, and in some respects that was okay because I really didn't have the time to do 2 shows a year, and the herd was a really good show for me. I kept winning larger and larger and larger prizes every year, and I hit the herd show at a good time. The market was actually hitting a downturn, and I mean the greater economy was, but I was new, and so I was priced lower than a lot of established artists and collectors that were wanting to add to their collection on a smaller budget could afford me. And my stuff was novel, so it was actually not a bad time for me, and I kept my prices relatively low and was happy to be there and working, and it facilitated me being able to stay at home with my daughter, so it worked out really well for a while.
Now, do you still do the herd museum show?
I do not.
When did you
The
stop?
last that was 7 years ago, I believe, was my last time there, and I won Best of Show. And in the controversy after I won Best of Show, it came out that I was not enrolled. The herd knew this, but I guess the audience a lot of times glossed over it or didn't hear it. And the Herd Museum was put into a really tough spot. They received federal funding, and that federal funding has become more and more tightly enforced to only support programs that are, all the members have to be federally enrolled. And I'm not, and I can't be. And so that was a problem. The Herd Museum had every year reviewed my application and was aware of that, and had been okay with that, but with the added pressure, they had to disinvite me the next year, even though I was the Best of Show winner. So it was both the better thing to happen to me and not so great. But in the end, what it was is it also kind of set me free, because the market shows, the way that you succeed at the market shows is making the pieces that succeed at the market shows. So doing things that are too far out there or unmarketable isn't how you win, and it isn't how you sell, and it isn't how you move forward. And you can also get caught in the endless sort of spin cycle of, I have to make a big piece for the show, and then I only have time to finish my commissions, and now it's time to start the next big piece. And it can be really hard for an artist to take the time to try new work, or to build up, which I think is even more important, to build up a body of work so that you can show a gallery show or a museum show, so that you can show progression or a theme, work through ideas. Single stunning pieces are really fun to do, but they don't tell your story. They tell a snapshot. And it's also, it's a very competitive place. And at that point, I didn't really need to do it anymore either. The better thing about it was that after that, I needed to, and I wanted to rebrand myself, not just as a Native artist, but as just take Native out of it and say, I'm a fiber artist. And I come from a variety of backgrounds, and I'm Irish, and I'm Lebanese, and I'm Native, and I'm a lot of things, but I'm a fiber artist. And so once I took away the necessity of being labeled and put into Native-only shows, I found that I can go a lot more places, and I can show and apply to galleries that would, as a Native artist, would never have shown me. And I don't have to only make work that looks Native for a specific audience. I can do whatever I want now. It means that you're cut loose from the reliability of the herd shows, of those market shows, which are very, very comforting. They provide a lot of income to a lot of amazing artists, and they need that place to show their work. And it's true that as a Native artist, most mainstream galleries will never touch your work. They just won't do it. It's too ethnic, it's too something. and they won't touch it. So a lot of Native artists absolutely have to have those venues to show in, or there won't be any place to show in at all. But in my case, it was better to step out of that and to step away and to say, I'm going to take off some of these labels without changing who I am. And the downside about that is that in the aftermath of that, hearing how people were talking about my mother and my grandmother, their choices of partners, it's a really ugly thing to let people talk about you like a dog breed. It's a really awful thing to let people talk about you in fractions. Nobody's a fraction of a person, and to allow yourself to be sort of diminished, literally by fractions and pieces, until somebody says whether or not you deserve to be participating in this conversation or not, that's a very detrimental thing to somebody's psychological well-being, much less to your artistic future. So as painful as it was to hear those things said about me, that I didn't deserve to be there, that I didn't belong, that I wasn't really Native, and to have people questioning, my childhood, my background, and my family, it was also really freeing to just have to say, actually, I don't care, and I'm going to have to step away from this completely and not have this conversation. And at the same time, I'm not going to have to worry about whether or not the next show decides I'm not Native enough, because I'm simply going to tell them what I am and what I do, and they're either going to accept it or not. But I'm not going to have to worry about that anymore. So it's been freeing, and honestly, it's been a pretty good career move. As uncomfortable as it was at the time, right. it's been a really good career move.
Right. What are the more important galleries to you today?
I don't know that. I mean, I've worked a lot with the Lovitz Gallery here in town, and they've made a point of supporting Native artists whose work they like, and they're very specific that they choose to support what they like, and they don't necessarily feel like they need to justify it one way or another. They're pretty brave about that. The All My Relations Gallery in Minneapolis has been really supportive of region-wide and even sort of greater region-wide shows. I don't know that I'm working with any one gallery, although I will say the 108 Gallery here in Tulsa, as someone who's working towards this different idea of just seeing myself as a artist who works in fiber, it's been a wonderful, wonderful venue. But I found that a lot of, instead of specific galleries that support my work or show my work, it's been contacts with people. And there's a lot of independent curators right now. And then they build relationships with the institutions that they work with. And then they bring in the artists and they provide the opportunities. So it's rather than just one place, it's more about right now than the people who are making the connections between the artists and the places. And sometimes the place might, through that curator, be receptive to my work, where if it had been presented to them alone, they might not have had the person there to have that conversation and say, no, really, you ought to look at this. This could work with what you're trying to do here. So the people that have been working towards that have been Tony Tiger and Bobby Martin and Troy Jackson, Roy Boney and Candessa Teehee, Heather Atone. There's just this amazing group of artists and scholars and writers and curators, and sometimes they're all of the above, and they're all really working together, and the mutual support in this region is amazing. It's something I hadn't anticipated, and but it's been really spectacular that all these artists, really have this attitude of, everybody's boats are going to rise together, and they're curating shows, and everyone's working together to create opportunities, rather than just waiting for opportunities to come knock at the door. They rarely do. And so but there's just some wonderful collaboration and inclusion. I haven't seen the slightest bit of a good old boys club here. It's really wonderful.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to ask you how you got to Oklahoma, and then clearly this is one of the benefits.
I have a good story about how I got here. I was living in Montana, and the downside about being in such a gorgeous, remote, rural place like Montana is that it has an incredibly small population base. Fewer than 1 million people in the state. Don't tell me. And then, so every piece of my work sold out of state. Every major show. I mean, I had a solo show at the Yellowstone Art Museum in Billings and the Missoula Art Museum in Missoula, and that's about it. There's a couple of other venues, but it's a real small population in place. So I was already traveling a lot, and I was already thinking about my future, my daughter's future, and being unwilling to stay in Montana because it's a very poor place, and seeing a lot of other really talented, successful people there still living basically in poverty, and wanting something different. And I knew that my work was not going to go well on the West Coast because my work looks very Western. It has a very Western feel to it. And the West Coast definitely, even though Seattle's an 8-hour drive away, is definitely they have a very narrow ideal of what their artwork should look there, and I simply wasn't going to work well in Seattle or Portland. I don't do Northwest Coast. I don't do carved wood. I don't. And so I had visited Tulsa for a couple of shows, for the Cherokee Art Market and for another for 2 years, and was surprised at how much I liked it here. First of all, Tulsa was green and gorgeous, and it was also a place where I could wear cowboy boots to an art opening. It was kind of important to me. I was from the West, and I wore cowboy boots and liked that, and I didn't want to be in a place where people couldn't be like that. And then I had the piece in Changing Hands, and the Changing Hands exhibit came to Tulsa, and Christina Burke was the curator. She was a new curator at the time, and she asked if I would come down and bring some more of my pieces and do a little mini exhibit and a lecture and a master's workshop for teachers. So we focused actually on printmaking and using their collection, drawing out geometric designs and showing teachers how they can facilitate this in classroom exercises. So after 3 days of all these obligations and lectures, and Christina driving me and toting me to and fro, I wanted to go, all my obligations were done, and I wanted to go see some live music at the Cain's Ballroom I had heard about. And Christina was exhausted, and she begged out. She said, I just can't do it. And I said, I'm a big girl with a credit card and a cell phone, just drop me off and I'll go listen. And find my way back to the hotel. So I ended up meeting a really great guy that night. And
oh my goodness, that is a great story.
And so and as he reminds me, I wouldn't give him my phone number. He got my email address though for my business card. And so I met him, and he was wonderful. And I went back to Montana thinking I'm in really big trouble. And we started a long distance correspondence, and eventually I let him have my phone number. And a year later, just over a year later, we were married in Missoula and put all my stuff in a U-Haul and drove here. So
wow.
I was already thinking about this place. I liked everything about it. Tulsa there was financial opportunities here, and it was pretty, and it was the West. I could still wear cowboy boots, and there was so much happening here. I mean, you could just feel the buzz of Native artists and that surprised me because everyone assumes that the Southwest or the Northwest or somewhere else is the hub, but I really think it's here. And so it was intriguing how much was happening here, and all these factors and being in love and everything. So we got married, and he convinced me to moving here.
Tell us a little bit about your upcoming show at the Great Plains Museum in June. Do you know, I think it's called Contemporary Indigeneity too. I read about that online, maybe.
I don't think I'm in that.
Okay. So was
that on my website?
No, it was on theirs, I believe, or it was something I Googled in connection with you.
Okay. So. I think the contemporary indigeneity, which is the hardest word to spell ever, is it's an ongoing juried show, either annually or biannually. And I've applied to that and had pieces. Actually, I think one of the pieces we're going to look at later is one of the pieces from that. So that's a group juried show. Okay. That happens I think it might be biannual now.
Okay.
But with the Great Plains Museum, I was also their artist in residence one year.
Oh, okay.
And so traveled there because they saw my work in the first contemporary indigeneity and liked it and invited me to apply. And that was a wonderful experience because I worked with the Great Plains Museum to had a solo show, but then also created a specific commission piece for them to have in their permanent collection, and worked on site on the piece for 2 weeks, and did tours and talks with kids and all those good things. And it's a really interesting museum because it's interdisciplinary. So they have, they talk about farming, and they talk about the landscape, and they talk about art. And the museum is meant to be the art venue where a lot of these ideas get expressed. Mm-hmm. But the institute itself, the Great Plains Institute, maybe I'm saying that wrong, combines everything from cartography to geology to ethnology. I mean, they combine all these disciplines to study what is the Great Plains and why is that a unique place or a unique idea. The downside was beadwork is not very exciting for people to watch. So for 2 weeks I was beading, which beadwork is just pretty much me hunched over with terrible posture, right? Doing tiny work. And then the other thing was that I had to time it so that I had this commission piece ready for the end of the show. Wow. Yeah. So I had to try and time it so that I had enough to work on in front of people, and I had easily 45 minutes to spare before at the end of 2 weeks as I was finishing, before the final, we put it on a pedestal and it was done. But that was the first piece I ever did with QR codes. So that was my experimentation, was to bring, because they are interdisciplinary in that institute, to bring this element of science into, and I had worked on science pieces before. I did a solo show at Lovett's Gallery with all science pieces, but to bring this element of map making and history and ornithology, and because each panel had a bird species on it and a plant species, and then there was a QR code that would give you the latitude and the longitude and the name of the location where that biosphere, that gene would be found. So it was, I really love that I can bring my love of science into the beadwork pieces.
And is that the first time you used the Japanese beads?
No, I had really liked the delicas before that. Actually,
but there is a connection between being able to do QR codes.
Yeah, I had liked the delicas before that, and most beadworkers frown on delicas. They're considered not the right kind of bead, because delicas are a perfect tube, a cylinder, and European beads, or the Czech beads, are I'm trying to remember the exact name of it. They're shaped like a donut, so they're round, but they're round on all the sides, and that's really great for working around curves and lines. But I have an affinity for this precision that comes with it. So I'd already been working with delicas in a lot of small ways because I like that precision. But when I did the piece that won Best of Show at the Herd was a cradle board, and it was a Salish style cradle board with a fully beaded headboard up above the baby, and I did the florals in all different kinds of beads, but I did the background entirely in delicas, and it was excruciating and problematic. But the end result was so crisp and so clean. That I thought it was worth it. And but when it comes to the QR codes, the delicas are what make the QR codes possible, because while they're a three-dimensional object, they're shaped almost like a can, like a can of food. And if you were to lay a can on its side, look straight down, it would really be a rectangle. And so that way I can bead this pattern, and then from straight above, it actually can be flattened into 2 dimensions of black and white. So it can be read as a binary. As a positive and a negative, as long as I get it right, and as long as all the beads are in the right spot, which usually happens more than you would think. I'm better at it, but I do have to take a lot out and count. So the QR codes are my way of embedding text into pieces, and making beadwork literally readable, maybe for modern audiences.
Well, let's talk about your process and techniques a little bit more. Do you do all your bead shopping online, or all your material shopping?
I do the majority now. I used to shop locally, even as a teenager and as a kid. There were always local shops, but I'm finding more and more that I like to just order online, and I know the colors that I like, and I tend to buy them that way. But every now and then you find a great bead shop and you go a little crazy. And I think the biggest bead shopping I ever did is there was this small shop in Blackfoot, Idaho, and on the way back from the Herd one year, I had heard that the woman who ran it was in her 90s and she was going to close it. and I think I spent $1,000 on beads. And I walked out with a package that was, smaller than a sandwich because they were micro beads and tiny amounts and vintage, and I went a little crazy. But so every now and then you find something because of its rarity that you probably couldn't find online. Although now the internet has leveled all that out.
Mm-hmm.
Every little antique store that finds beads in such a state can sell them on eBay. So you can go on eBay and find amazing vintage and antique finds. So it's really leveled that all out.
And some of the boxes where you were working on that hand-dyed wool, were you dyeing your wool?
I wasn't.
Okay.
I found some wonderful women in Montana that were running a quilting shop, and they loved it that I wanted to use this, that they were getting the raw white woven wool and dyeing it themselves. And so I could work with them and say, I want it extra streaky, I want it this color. And most of the women who came into their shop were just they wanted little tiny pieces, but I wanted yardage, and I wanted it with streaks and variations and mistakes and stuff in it, lots and lots of it, because I found that even a solid black hand dyed has more depth to it than a commercial, simply because of the way our eyes read those variations. It's like the fabric literally gets to drop back and provide a real background for it. So I started, as soon as I found them and the kind of small scale art they were doing, I pulled away from using commercial wools and was exclusively using theirs. And they've closed shop, and I'm devastated. So I may have to learn how to now. I try not to add more skills.
Right.
I already have enough skills, and I'm also, my accountant and my my photo archivist and a lot of other skills. So when somebody says, well, you know how to tan, I'm like, but I really don't want to, and I don't want to dye wool, and I don't want to.
That's the time factor.
Knit, and I don't want to, I can only have so many time takings and supply driven skills before I just have maxed out. And I don't want to be an expert in wool dyeing. I just want to find someone who's really good at it, and I can pay them to do it.
Maybe they'll listen to this interview.
Yes.
Your work seems pretty much split between geometric and figurative.
Yes. In the beginning it was all geometric, and then I started to add in elements of animal sort of figures, more stemming from ledger drawing styles. So the horse heads were kind of coming out of ledger drawings, and some of that, and also older pictorial beadwork. There's a strong element of pictorial beadwork, but I wanted to do things maybe a little more realistic. And also a good Jackie Larson Bread was a good friend of my mom's, and because of her work, she does photorealism. That's mostly what she's known for in her beadwork, and it is amazing. But she also does a lot of pictorial style beadwork, sort of taking that older drawing style from ledger drawings and hide counts and converting it into a real graphically dominated beadwork style. And seeing some of her work when I was starting out. She was friends with my mom, and I didn't know she was famous. She would probably still say she's not famous, but she is. And she was a real encouragement when I was first getting started. Actually, my thesis show, my junior review, was not well received, and Jackie sent me a letter and just told me to keep my head up and keep on keeping on, and it would figure itself out.
Oh, how neat.
Yeah.
When you're working on a piece, are you working on one piece straight through, or are you working on different pieces simultaneously?
If I have my way, I try to have about 3 pieces. I try to have one large, long-term project that's really, really intensive that I'm working at in sections, and then I try to have some other medium-sized piece that I can kind of pick at, and then I try to have something small, jewelry or edging, that I can do that requires a lot less thought, and also that I can finish quickly, because the long projects can sap your staying power.
Right.
When you've worked on a project for 3 or 4 months, you can start to feel like it'll never. There's no sense of accomplishment.
Right.
And so sometimes the smaller projects help kind of clear the palette a little bit and help you stay motivated. Even though you're taking time away, it's helping to recharge a little bit. And on the bigger projects, you can work with one color for so long that you never want to see that color again. You feel in background, you go, I never want to see light blue ever again.
What kinds of research do you do for your pieces?
Well, I do a lot of figurative work with birds that are rendered realistic. So I do a lot of reviewing and looking at nature photography, and then I also do a lot of. I mean, the internet has changed research. Mm-hmm. When I was starting off, the internet was still kind of this proto, almost kind of there, and I did all my research in libraries, and I would look up everything from kitchen design books and just trying to get ideas for graphics. And obviously I would look up, beadwork, books and photos, and some of the early online discussion groups that discussed, Northern Plains tribal art, things like that were good sources of photos and museum collections. But really quickly, the internet outpaced those things. And I can literally sit down and research a project in 10 minutes if I want now. Mm-hmm. And I can also go online and I can talk to other artists. We talk to each other, and we ask questions, and we share new projects. And so now the rate of inspiration and information, it just has gone up exponentially. And now sometimes it's harder to sort of sort some of that out and have time to actually get away from other influences and kind of step back. But I really like modern design. I spend a lot of time on Pinterest looking at everything from rugs to dishes. I really like contemporary design of those sorts of types, and so I look for ideas in a lot of those places. Paint shows where they show color palettes and stuff. I mean, those are great sources. So I tend to kind of create these little research files on my computer where I have everything from paint chips to pictures of birds to, someone's kimono that's just the most amazing colors, or a flower or something, and kind of put that all together, and then figure out what I'm thinking about when I'm looking at all those things. Why are those interesting to me? Why am I picking them out? And then try to reduce it down, and then I draw. But I never draw in color. I only draw in black and white, because I don't think there's hardly any point to drawing beads. Because the beads, I mean, you can't pick your colors. You can't mix them, I guess. So you have to work with the colors that you're given, and sometimes the texture is more important than the color. So if something's red, well, there's red, but there's red matte, and there's red luster, and there's red glossy. And so when I pick beads out for a project, I actually get them all out. I'll get like 150 colors out, big trays, and lay them all out and put them next to each other. And because the other thing is they do strange things next to each other. They play off of each other. They bounce off each other. So you might love this green and this red, but they can't do much besides. And one color is an outline versus a background. Or again, there's a lot of trial and error, and you rip out a lot of beads. And I do jewelry as prototypes. So if I'm researching a pattern, if I think I'm going to like this pattern, I might do a really small version of it as a pair of earrings to jumpstart it and go, well, what do these colors look like next to each other? And do little versions. And also I hate to throw it out, so I do earrings. So they might be a little sampler of what I think I'm going to do, and try it out. But I'm also working with different backgrounds. A beadworker that's filling in the plane completely is a different process than when you're dealing with this negative space behind it. So whether it's a print or a photo or something I've hand drawn or wool, there's always this other factor to kind of cooperate with. And that's a little bit different than just filling it in completely.
And you have kind of made a bit of a shift away from fabric and towards paper.
I am, yeah. I've started the shifting to working on paper. Started with working with a few prints. I was intentionally made a series of dry points. I'm working at Bobby Martin's studio, and I left these lines, these gaps in the dry point etchings where I wanted to put in a row of lane style beadwork and try it. And so that was my first endeavor, and that was to use that process of intentionally leaving gaps where I meant to put beadwork. And those turned out really, really well. I really liked the effect. And the logic behind it was that I was not able to make as many projects as I wanted, and certainly not in price points for collectors or friends that I wanted, because each piece involved so many hours that by the time I finished it, I was priced out of my own work. I couldn't afford to have one. So making something that didn't, and also I found that the people who were interested in my work were not interested in the construction. So they didn't really care the way I did about how a purse was sewn together, or or the structure behind a box. They wanted to see the image and the color and the composition. And beyond that, it really didn't. And most of my larger projects are probably half construction. So if I've made a complicated purse with beadwork and construction, and the entire thing is handmade and bound in silk, and they might never even open it. I mean, it's to who am I making all this endeavor for? So try to back away from that and to make art that had all the same qualities as the other pieces I was working on, but didn't require a month for each project, to be able to work through things a little faster, to be able to make enough for a show or some gallery inventory, and sometimes to move on to a new idea. So now I've been working on paper in a variety of ways, sometimes printmaking, and sometimes ink and pencil work, sometimes now collaborating on photographs, and sometimes with solid beadwork on paper, where the entire thing is on paper, but that's the matrix that I'm starting on. And working sort of mostly two-dimensional, it would be like 2.25 dimensions.
Right.
They come off the paper some, but they're mostly on these wood panels. And then working with wood panels too is the delivery system. They are pretty fragile the way I'm installing them right now, but I like the space.
It's a neat look. We'll see them in a minute. So what's your creative process from the time you get an idea?
I generally use sketchbooks and idea books to write the idea down, usually in words, and try to kind of brainstorm out from that. And I start making rough sketches in my little computer files with all my inspiration photos and ideas, and then I start drawing it and thinking about it. And I also tend to think about it at night. Often early morning wake up times is when I do my best kind of idea thinking about it, and running through different possibilities and trying to trial and error it out before I actually start. And then if it's on the boxes, what I generally do is I take graph paper and I measure out the exact dimensions it's going to be, and then I draw out each side, and I don't have to tape it together like a mock-up. I'm pretty good three-dimensional that I can make it in my head, and I can turn it. So I can make it and spin it and make it taller or wider or do whatever. And it just is about sort of sitting and thinking about it. And then I do the graph paper to see if the dimensions I'm thinking about, how the numbers will really work out. And then from there I make a graph paper template for each side, for each panel. And I cut it out in wool and pellon and in wood, and cut the wool much larger so that I have a lot of edge. And then I use quilter's tape or painter's tape, and I use a real low adhesive tape to outline the graph paper size so that I know what the interior size is going to be. And from there I generally use thread and make halfway marks, and so I make this grid of reference points with that, because the downside about working with a negative space background is that I can't draw on it. So if I were filling in the background, I could just draw it and then fill in all the colors. But with a negative space background, I have to leave it as is, and there's nothing really that is safe to draw on silk or wool. And so what I usually do is I create the outline, and then I create the grid, and then I if I'm doing figurative work, I draw the figure out entirely and in as much detail as I can on tracing paper, and then I baste stitch the tracing paper to the surface, and then I use a needle and I carve out the tiny little area I'm going to bead. And I fill in the gap, and then I carve out the next tiny little area I'm going to bead, and I fill that in, and I keep doing that reductively until I've filled in all of the space, and then I can rip off the tracing paper and see against the background and see the edges. And so on all my realistic birds, that's how I do it on wool, is through that reductive method, and figuratively trying to figure out how to make it look semi-realistic. I know they're not looking realistic, but it should have enough motion and stuff to evoke what it looks like realistically. And if it's not a figurative, then I actually work out the math on graphing paper, and I just start in the middle. And I just start counting, because there's a lot of math, and if it's geometric beadwork, it's just counting and counting and counting, and figuring out the math of the reduction and the expansion, because the beads are not perfect squares, and so if you're going to, you have to figure out your math, and your lane is going to be an even or an odd number, and that will differentiate what kind of angles you can make. So
thank goodness for your science
background. Yeah, there's this idea in art school that that's where students who don't want to go math should go. That's where they should major. Maybe there's other kinds of art where you don't have to do a lot of math, but I have to do a lot of math, and sort of symbolic thinking like that. I don't know if it was the safe haven for math that a lot of other students thought it was going to be. But
well, looking back on your career so far, what has been one of the high points?
That is kind of tough. Honestly, I think I think having the piece in the Museum of Arts and Design, I think having the piece in the Changing Hands was definitely a high point. It was early, and it was a really big step, and it was a big step for me to step out of my region, my provincial kind of start, and to think, I think I could really do this. I think this might happen. And another random point was to meet someone and to have them tell me that they used photos of my work in their class. Wow. At a college level class, they were using photos of it to teach. And I was in shock, and because you don't think anyone knows about you. You were constantly banging on the door trying to get somebody to care who you are. And I think I was pretty wide-eyed about that. The idea that you want to make something that lasts and that matters, and then the idea creeps in that maybe it does, and that maybe it is right now lasting and mattering. That would be a very high point. And on a personal high point, I made a piece probably 7 years ago, and it had in the center of it had 3 Salish women digging bitterroot, and it was a wall hanging, rather small but pretty intensely worked, and they were standing in front of this mountain in Missoula that's now developed, and they were wearing a lot of traditional Salish, the silk headscarves and some of this other stuff. And Victor Charlot, who's a Salish and a playwright and someone I've known most of my life, if not all of it, he was there at this art function. It was a fundraiser for the Montana Artist Residency, and we were both associated with it. And his daughter April was there, and he looked at it and he got a little choked up, and he said it reminded him of his mother. And at that moment, I thought, I made something that matters, not just to the audience out there telling me whether it's good or it's bad, but I made something that made somebody feel something. It evoked something for him about his mothers and what they wore, and digging bitterroot and their tools. And I worked really hard to get the tools right and their headscarves right and everything right. And there's a moment where it works, and where somebody that's important to you feels something important, and that it might last a little bit. It might be kind of a little part of that record. And so that was a personal moment where I thought, whether it sells or it doesn't sell or whatever, it matters a lot in this moment, and that's a highlight for me.
What about one of the low points?
The low. I have two low points that are different but pretty similar, and they both ended up well, so they're good stories. The first one was in college, my junior review. The BFA program as a junior, you have to have a formal review process before you're a senior. The idea is not to let students who aren't prepared have the distinction of a BFA. They would have to get a BA instead. So I did the junior review, and about half of it was work that was leading towards the parfleche. But they were in ceramics, actually, not in, I was painting parfleche on porcelain, which I thought was interesting. And then the other half of my works were the ceramic food. Very pop arty and kind of silly. But it's what I had as a junior, so I presented it. And then I got anonymous comments from the faculty. They literally said, leave the parfleche to your mother. Stop doing this. and they were anonymous. And I asked the faculty if they would please talk about this, if they would let me come in and talk about it, because I had almost nothing but negative comments on the comment section of my review, but I was passed with flying colors as far as numerically. And to actually say my mother in there was incredibly demeaning and insulting, and it was derogatory is what it was. It was meant to be a slam at the heritage, at who I was, and that they knew that this was influenced by my background and by my mother's participation in Native culture. It was definitely a slam, and they wouldn't address it. So I found a loophole, and I found that if they pass you on the junior review, they can't tell you what it's going to be on. So you could get reviewed in one style and do a different style. You don't have to do one thing. So I decided that they were going to have to look at parfleche for another year. So I did my entire senior thesis in parfleche patterns and designs. The downside was, because I was working in a non-traditional fiber art, is I had to forfeit my studio. I was only allowed to have a studio space in the ceramics department, and they just could never seem to find any space for me to work on campus in any other medium. So I ended up working out of my home, which was ostracizing to a degree, because I wasn't working with other students like you should be as a senior, and I had to work at home. And it's literally marginalized. Here's the outline, and you are going to have to be outside of it, even though you're a senior and you've worked towards this up to this time. That was demoralizing. And when I had my solo show 2 years later, not one professor came to see it, even though it was a mile from campus. So that was demoralizing. But my senior thesis show was scheduled to exhibit the very one they didn't really want to see, and I had the solo show. So whether they showed up or not, I had it, and it was well received. So that lack of support. In the end, it was a little bit of a stumbling block, but a lot of other people encouraged me, and it went well. The other low point was definitely the aftermath after the herd, after winning the best of show. But again, the realizations coming out about that, and the opportunity to redefine myself was one that I took and profited from. And so even though that was a low point, to hear some of the criticisms or to hear some of this really negative talk, it's been far better in the long run to be really, really honest about where I come from and what I want to do, and to have that kind of openness with all of the curators and other artists I work with. And I think it makes it easier for other people to talk about what diaspora is, and what creating a new definition of yourself when you do come from multiple backgrounds. And I think if more people stop feeling that they have to segment themselves out or pick one or the other, it gives you an opportunity to talk about what is this kind of new breed, instead of just being a breed and being a whole person. And I did feel a little trapped before that I had to be one thing or another, and only talk about one part of my background, and leave other things out because they were disadvantages to my career. So definitely a low point, but on the other hand, I walked away and was like, well, I won. I won Best of Show. I'm probably not going to win it again, and I don't need to. So I did it. I'll take my award and go home. And if that's how it has to be, that's how it has to be. But I don't have to stop. And so in the long run, it has turned out to be an opportunity.
Well, is there anything we forgot to mention before we take a look at your work?
I can't think of it. I've covered a lot in a rambling fashion, but if there's any other questions that you think we've missed, but I can't think of it.
Okay.
Otherwise, we can look at.
Yeah, we're going to look at some pieces of art here. So Molly, you want to tell me about this piece?
This is a combination of beadwork and photo etchings. It was a collection of photo etching trials I actually did in college and didn't use at the time and saved. The center one is a portrait of me in my traditional outfit when I was 18, and the photo on the left is my great-grandmother and her outfit getting ready for powwow, and the one on the right is her family when she was away at boarding school, her siblings and her mother and father. So I took all these photos and wanted to highlight them as a triptych for put them together and use the beadwork almost as kind of the saint imagery and,
Right.
and draw the outlines around them. So I used the fire color scheme on the 2 older portraits, and then the blue for the image of myself. And so this is kind of a little bit of just a family piece,
Right.
about our photos and the beadwork that goes throughout, because my grandmother in the left is wearing, or great grandmother is wearing a fully beaded dress top and getting her hair braided.
Oh, yeah.
And then in the center I'm wearing my dress, and then on the right my great grandmother's brother actually has a beaded boy's suit, so it has the floral patterns.
Yeah, I see that now.
There's usually a vest pant combo worn over a commercial fabric.
Right.
So he has the old style Sioux floral style
Right,
his outfit. His mother was a wonderful beadworker.
That is cool. Okay. All right, so how about your box here?
This piece has 2 scissor tail flycatchers on the front in realistic poses flying. And then on the back, on the verso, there's an abstract geometric rendering of the same birds of my own design. And then the interior is opens up to an orange interior with geometric designs. And I'm just in love with the scissor tail flycatchers after moving here.
Yes.
And they're such an emblem of this area. And I had wanted to do a piece about them. So the outside is this, bright blue sky with the 2 different versions, the geometric and the realistic flycatchers. And then the interior is this, really orange, which I think of the Oklahoma soil, and this red orange that comes out.
Right.
And then some of the beadwork designs inspired by some of the beadwork I've seen since I've moved here, some of the Kiowa and Apache styles with the blue and white kind of candy striping moving through it. And so it was a contrast of earth and sky, of literally the ground, and also hide and the yellow and orange stain that's put on a lot of moccasins here, and just some of these collections of impressions.
Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, we're looking at some works on paper here.
Yeah, these are a combination of ink drawings, colored pencils, and thread work and beadwork on paper. So a combination of a lot of different techniques. I was wanting to play around with some more spontaneous, interdisciplinary stuff, and really, feeling an urge to draw again. And the birds, the scissor-tail flycatcher is just really, really a fun motif to play with. They're so kind of lyrical, the way that they move in their tails. And so these 2 different pieces, one more sort of flat and symmetrical, and one more in motion,
Right.
Referencing a lot of modern design and pop culture colors and some things like that. But also working with thread to create texture, so trying to draw with thread. The one on the right has blue and red accents in thread embroidery.
Oh, yeah.
And then the one on the left, a lot of what looks like black lines that are drawn are actually black thread. So a combination of black ink and thread, and then gold beads on a colored background. So just trying to play with color and design, but really enjoying working on the Bristol board paper and mounting these pieces out from the wood panels so that they float in front of the form that they're mounted on.
The panels are a nice presentation. All right, and how about this piece?
This piece is beadwork on a photo, and it's a collaboration with Roy Graff, a young photographer that I met. I've been wanting to incorporate photographs of landscape and then work geometric designs over the surface, and loved his photography and thought this was an opportunity to work directly with a photographer. So he's supplying the photographs and having them printed on this beautiful paper, and then I'm working the geometric designs over the surface and mounting them in the same manner that I'm doing some of the other paperwork. So working on a series upcoming, more pieces of landscape photography. And so he's able to produce the images with the rich, deep colors that I want, and then I can do the geometric designs over the top.
They're very powerful images. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Molly.
Thank you.